Hi guys, Michael Abaimi here. Today, I'd like to talk about Foundation on Apple TV+. So the second season of the TV show just wrapped up yesterday, and I came out of it with a mix of emotions. Basically, the show as a whole definitely had its highs and highlights, but I would say that overall, my experience with the show has been one filled with disappointment. So the purpose of this video is just for me to try and explain why I ultimately feel the show was a missed opportunity. But before we get into the thick of it, I think it actually helps to give a bit of context by setting the stage a bit. The show is based on a series of books written by Isaac Asimov, and this series of books actually originated as a series of short stories and novellas that were published in a science fiction magazine during the 1940s and early 50s. They are actually considered some of the greatest science fiction stories ever written, going on to influence books like Dune, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and most notably, the Star Wars series of movies. So as you can see, this is like a story that is considered to be on the very topmost echelon of science fiction. So expectations heading into any kind of adaptation were quite high. And for the longest of times, it was actually believed that the source material was pretty much unfilmable, owing mainly to the way the books were written as different short stories, each one having its own cast of characters. Like, it wasn't like a coherent, ongoing story, even though it had like connecting threads that were going to connect everything together. So the books themselves were about the titular Foundation, a colony of scientists that was established by a man named Harry Seldon. He had basically devised a way to predict the future through a branch of mathematics called psychohistory. The idea behind the whole thing was that you can't really predict what a single person is going to do in the future, but you can actually predict with some degrees of accuracy what a larger group of people is going to do. So this was why psychohistory was referred to as the science of mobs, because you can actually tell that based on what's happening right now, that a group of people are going to be in a specific situation in a number of years. So using that psychohistory, Harry was able to see that the current galactic empire was currently on a downward spiral, and it was actually going to take at least 30,000 years before another galactic empire would rise to take its place. So in a bid to reduce the amount of time, those 30,000 years of barbarism that were expected, he devised the idea of coming up with two foundations established on opposite ends of the universe. And based on the interactions of both foundations, a new, more efficient empire would rise in just the span of 1,000 years. So the whole thing sounds a bit convoluted, to be honest, but that was the main conceit behind the whole narrative of the books and, by extension, the recent TV show. All that said, my main issue with the adaptation on Apple TV Plus is how the showrunners have chosen to approach the source material. So basically, rather than trying to adapt the book for what it was, they've taken the loose adaptation approach, and what that means is that most of the time, a lot of the story threads from the actual books are nowhere to be seen, and what we have in its place are some very cookie cutter and generic science fiction. They've tried to dumb down the entire books to make it more accessible, which I actually concede that yes, it was needed, because the books themselves are quite dense. Like, the very first time I tried to read the books, I remember that I couldn't get past the second or third page. But coming back to it a few years later, I was finally able to appreciate the brilliance for what it was. So yeah, obviously it needs to be made more accessible so that more people can actually enjoy the story. But the core problem I have with the show is the extent to which they've gone to really butcher the source material, because that's all I can refer to it as, a butchering. The story deviates so heavily that sometimes I even wonder if I'm actually watching a Foundation adaptation. Because aside from the show being called Foundation and them having some characters that share the same names with characters from the books, the show could pretty much pass for something else entirely. Like, it is very hard for me to actually dive into the crux of the problem without touching upon spoilers, but I'll try and remain as loose and spoiler free as possible. One of the first things I noticed while watching the first season when it originally debuted in 2021 was the fact that a lot of the characters had been gender swapped or even completely race swapped, which is actually par for the course with Hollywood right now, and to an extent I can really not blame them that much, because the original source material didn't really have as much diversity or representation as people expect today. But the mere act of making a character a different race or a different gender doesn't now excuse you or absolve you of the responsibility of having to make that character actually intriguing. Which brings me to the fact that almost all the main characters in the show are pretty much uncharismatic and generally unlikable. And it is very hard for me as an audience member to invest in the struggles of those characters when I actually don't care about the characters themselves. This is a fault of the writing in general, and I feel the reason why this has happened is because, once again, they've chosen to focus on all these woke themes and all these things like inclusion and diversity at the expense of actually writing fully rounded, well-developed characters that people can actually invest in. You can have your character be whatever gender, whatever race. You can even have it be an alien or a space octopus for all I care. But at the end of the day, for me to actually invest in the story of that character, you have to make the character look intriguing enough. You have to give the character something meaty for the audience to invest in. And that was just missing from the characterization in Foundation. I'll confess that yes, the books themselves were not exactly character driven, because the books were more concerned with that overarching picture of these two foundations trying to navigate those 1,000 years that are supposed to bring about the new empire. So they didn't really settle upon any one single character. In fact, each new story, each new crisis in the stories had a different cast of characters, because each one was set in a different period of time, maybe like 100 years in the future or 50 years in the future. So it was always a different cast of characters in each new one. And I concede that yes, it might have been difficult for them to do the show that way, except they were willing to maybe do it like an anthology where maybe like they have a 3-episode arc, then the next 3 episode will be another group of characters. But what they chose to do instead was to give us a core group of characters that we can follow along the journey. It just so happens that that core group of characters are pretty much unlikable. All that said, I actually have to concede that there are some characters that have redeeming qualities, that had solid character arcs within the show. But the problem is that all of this is mixed with a lot of melodrama. Like, you find out that there's just a lot of padding and melodrama going on, which once again would be fine if I actually cared about the characters in the center of the drama. So I just feel it was on the showrunners and the writers to actually write these characters in a more compelling way. In fact, there was a point during the second season that I almost actually gave up on the show entirely. Like, I just watched something that I actually thought was the worst episode of television I've seen in my life. So it was so bad that actually I had to go online to check to just see what the general consensus was. And you can't imagine my shock when I actually checked the scores on Rotten Tomatoes and I saw that the show currently had 100% for the second season. I don't really know what those guys watched. Then again, I'm happy that they enjoyed it, but obviously these stories as they stand is not something that was made for fans of the original stories. In which case, I wonder why they even bothered to make a Foundation adaptation if they actually wanted to make so many changes that it would become unrecognizable. So they should have just gone ahead and pretty much made an original story and not rope us book fans in. I of course have to give props where props are due, and one of the areas where the show really excels is in its production values. Like, you can actually see where all the money went, because this is an Apple TV Plus production, and I think Apple TV Plus have pretty much established themselves as the forerunner when it comes to science fiction shows of this caliber with what they did with Silo, and the same thing is reflected here. The production design, the special effects, everything looks stellar. Those aspects of the show actually look stellar. Then in terms of like acting as well, there were actually a few standout performances. Like I said, there were some characters that I actually enjoyed seeing on screen, and most of that was driven by the actors behind those performances. So I actually enjoyed those aspects of the show. But I have to say that overall, everything taken into consideration, and considering that I had actually read the books and how I actually felt about the books and how the books are held in such high esteem, I would say that this is the reason why I ultimately came out of the show feeling disappointed. But once again, I'm happy for those that are actually having a good time enjoying it and watching it, and I would encourage anybody that has any kind of curiosity to try and check it out as well and potentially form their own opinion. Anyway, these are just my thoughts about Foundation and Apple TV Plus. Have you been watching the show? Did you watch the first season? Are you caught up with the second season? What did you think about any of it? Let me know in the comment section down below. Don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed watching this discussion, and to subscribe to the channel with notifications turned on if you'd like to see more discussions like this in the future. And until the next one, this is Michael, signing off.